Thank you for that. Pray for them on a regular basis. I know every name on that list would certainly appreciate your prayers. Well, we come tonight to a very significant moment in the book of Job. And we've been in this study for several weeks now. And what we're about to do is we're going to fast forward a little bit because as I've said several times, there's a lot of repetition in the book of Job as they go through these cycles of speeches where Job's three friends stand up and basically they all say the same thing. And that makes sense because we find out they all got together before they came to see Job and they kind of figured it out, at least in their mind, what was going on. So they basically continue each time one of them stands up to speak to tell Job, hey, you know what? You're a hypocrite. You're a secret sinner. You've mocked God in some way. And everything that's happened to you is God's way of punishing you for being such a bad person. What you need to do is acknowledge that you're a wicked person, acknowledge that you've sinned, and then maybe God will forgive you and restore you and make things better. Job, on the other hand, continues to protest that and say, you know what? I'm not saying I'm perfect, but as far as I know, I haven't done anything to offend God. There's no open sin, no secret sin in my life that I can look at and figure out and say, this is why God is doing this to me. And so they just kind of go back and forth in this. And they go through these 3 rounds of speeches where it starts off with Job standing up and talking to his friends about what's happened to him. And then one friend gets up and then Job answers, another friend gets up and Job answers, and another friend gets up and Job answers. Then they went through it again, a whole second cycle. Then they go through a third cycle. Now, as we come to the end of this third cycle, Job has just given a really long response, part of which we looked at last week. But now we're about to get introduced to a key character and one that has not showed up in the story until this point. Now, I'll be honest with you and tell you, there's a lot of debate about this guy, and there are some people who dismiss him and what he has to say entirely, and other people who don't. I'm going to give you some reasons, I think, for both, but there's no doubt he's got some valid things to say, and I'll show you some reasons why I think that's the case. But just understand, Job's 3 friends have all given 3 speeches, all except the last one. He only did 2. It was like when Job finally gave his last big answer, which lasts several chapters, the third friend is like, you know what, I got nothing else. Everybody has kind of gotten talked out. Now, I want you to think about conversations you've had with people because it's really fitting in what we're about to discuss. Have you ever been in a situation where you talked and talked and talked and you finally just ran out? You're just out of gas. You're out of words. You're out of arguments. You're just like, we're done, okay? Well, that's where everybody's kind of at. Job sits back down. His 3 friends, they're looking at the third guy. Well, it's your turn. And he's like, nope, done. Everybody's kind of done. And it's at that moment that we meet this guy. Now, watch what happens because this is very important. So these 3 men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Now, here it is from their vantage point. They're saying, you know what? We're done. We have talked and talked and talked and talked and talked all day long, and nothing we said has convinced you of the error of your ways. In your mind, you're right before God. You haven't done anything wrong, even though the circumstances you're in seem to convince all of us that you have done something terribly wrong and God is punishing you for that. So they just say, you know what? We're done. Now, then here he comes. Now watch this. This guy's really important. Then was kindled the wrath of Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite of the kindred of Ram. Against Job was his wrath kindled because he justified himself rather than God. Now, just pause with me here for a second. This guy Elihu has not been seen in the story yet. Now again, I want you to think about maybe conversations you've had with other people. Have you ever been in a really in-depth conversation with somebody, maybe at church, maybe at Walmart, maybe somewhere out in public, and all of a sudden you realize somebody else has just kind of walked up and they're just standing there listening? Now, I don't know if that ever happens to you, but I think for a lot of us that happens kind of regularly. And sometimes you're like, you're kind of looking, but they're not saying, they're just listening. Well, evidently, that's what this guy Elihu did. He has showed up. Now, we don't know exactly when he came along, although it must have been early in that day. because he's familiar with everything that's been said. So evidently he showed up right as this conversation was getting underway, and he's listened to everything Job has to say, and he's listened to everything Job's friends have to say. He's heard all the speeches, but he hasn't said a word. But then it says, when there was finally this moment of quiet, that he was angry with Job. Now here's why he's angry with Job. Because he justified himself rather than God. Now and we'll see this in a moment. Here's his argument with Job. Job, you're trying to make yourself look like the victim here and make this look like somehow this is God's fault. That God has abandoned you, that God has forgotten you, that God's not paying attention to you, that God is being capricious, that God is ignoring you, all these things. So he's mad at Job because of Job's attitude about God toward this. But notice he's not just mad at Job. Also, against his three friends was his wrath kindled because they had found no answer and yet had condemned Job. Now think about that for a second. He's mad at Job, but he's also mad at his three friends. Now think about that. This guy sat there all day, and you know the conclusion he's come to? I'm mad at everybody. I'm mad at all of you. I'm mad at I've listened to this whole deal, this whole debate. Job, I'm mad at you over your attitude towards God about what you're going through. And then he looks at his three friends and he says, and I'm really mad at you guys because you have talked and talked and talked, and yet you've been unable to make your case, and yet you condemn Job anyway. Now remember, what was the thrust of their case? The thrust of their case was, Job, you've done something terrible and God is punishing you. Now the problem with that, as we saw last week, in Job's last long answer, he pointed out, well, that doesn't make sense because there are evil people everywhere that live to a ripe old age, enjoy life, have big families, lots of wealth, seem to be happy, and yet they thumb their nose at God. They've got nothing for God. They're not spiritual at all. They treat other people terribly, but everything seems to go their way. Job said, you guys know that's true. And when Job finished, they didn't have no answer to that. And that's what this guy is saying. He's saying, you have no answer for Job's argument, and yet you condemn him anyway. It's like the three friends are saying, well, we can't prove that we're right, but we still think you're wrong. Now think about where the position. Have you ever talked to somebody that their mind was made up before the conversation ever started? And you can use all the logic in the world. Here's what my dad used to say. My dad used to say, talking to somebody like that's like talking to a 2x4. You're wasting your time. Not going to do any good. Okay? That's what these three guys have been. They have talked and talked and talked. Even this guy, who's also mad at Job, says, you three guys just need to admit, you have no answer for what Job is saying, and yet you still condemn him. You can't make your case, but you're insisting that he's guilty anyway. That would be like if you got arrested for a crime and you went to trial and the DA got up and told the judge and the jury said, listen, I don't have any evidence to prove this guy did it, but I'm convinced he did it anyway. Let's all find him guilty. That's where Job's three friends are. And this guy points it out. He points out, you guys have made no valid arguments. You have no answer for what Job has responded back to you, and yet you still condemn him. Now, let's go a little further because he's going to say some other really important things. Now remember, he's been around, he's been a part of this, and now he's kind of turning his focus on everybody. And Jason, I can't get anything to move up there. All right, there we go. Now, and I love how the Bible describes this guy. Now, Elihu had waited till Job had spoken because they were elder than he. Listen, this guy was raised probably by a mom like most of us had who said, don't talk when the grown-ups are talking, right? You remember being taught that when you were growing up? You don't interrupt the grown folks. You don't interrupt the older folks. And this guy didn't. He just sat there and he waited until there was a lull in the conversation, until everybody was talked out, because they were older than he was. When Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, then his wrath was kindled. When Job finally sat down after that really long answer, his last one, and these guys had no answer, no response, but yet they're all still mad at Job and they're all still convinced he's guilty even though they can't prove it, he got really mad. Now remember, he's mad at everybody. He's not just mad at the three friends, he's mad at Job too. And Elihu, the son of Barachel the Buzzite, answered and said, I am young and you're very old. Wherefore I was afraid and durst or dared not show you mine opinion. Now he starts off by saying, listen guys, I didn't want to say anything. You guys are old and I'm really young. And I was kind of intimidated to voice my opinion because, you know, like most people, I was taught to respect my elders, don't talk when the grown-ups are talking. But then he goes on to say, I said, days should speak and multitude of years should teach wisdom. In other words, he was like, the older people need to work this out. The older people need to solve this issue about Job. But then he realizes they're not going to. He says, but there is a spirit in man, and the inspiration of the Almighty giveth them understanding. Great men, now listen, this is true. And we all know this is true. Listen to what he says. Great men are not always wise. The word great here doesn't mean like great, like boy, he's great. It means old. What he's saying is old men are not always wise. Is that true? That's absolutely true. Just because somebody's old, listen, again, I go back to what my dad always told us. Just because you're old doesn't make you smart. Just because you're old doesn't make you a kind, grandfatherly, grandmotherly person. My dad always told us, he said, listen, when you get old, you just become more of what you were when you were younger. He said age is like a magnifying. I have found this to be so true in my own life and people. He said age is like a magnifying glass. If you're smart when you're young, you'll be wise when you're old. If you're stupid when you're young, you'll be even more stupid when you're old. And here's one we can all relate to. If you're mean-spirited when you're young, you don't hit 60 or 70 and all of a sudden turn into this loving person. You become even more mean-spirited. You become, and listen, I grew up next to this all my life. I've told before about how my dad always had provided, we had a basketball goal and stuff at our yard that he had fixed up on an old telephone pole, and all the kids in the neighborhood, we'd be out there playing, and we'd be playing in our yard. But we had a neighbor who was an elderly woman who, if the ball ever rolled over in her yard, she would attempt to get it and wouldn't give it back. You say, why? Because she was mean when she was young, I guess. And she got to be meaner as she got older. Because age is like a magnifying glass. And just because somebody's old doesn't mean they're wise. Those two things just don't go together. As I've often said, now listen, my grandfather, my Pawpaw Fulton, was wise in certain ways, but there was a lot of ways he wasn't wise at all. And I've talked about this. I've told you the stories about him burning leaves. You can be 80 years old, but if you pour 5 gallons of gas on a big pile of leaves and stand there and strike it, you are not wise. You are not wise. And he did that on a I mean, it wasn't like he did it once and it's like, okay, I learned my lesson. Now that I have no more eyebrows, I've learned my lesson. Nope, let's do it again. You know, we'll try that one more time. Age doesn't make somebody wise. And the flip side of that is true too. Just because somebody's young doesn't mean they don't have something to contribute, that they're not smart. Okay? He said, neither do the aged understand judgment. Therefore I said, hearken to me, I also will show mine opinion. He said, you know, I held back as long as I could. I thought, you guys, you're older, you're supposed to be wiser. I thought you'd solve it, but you haven't. And then he said, I realized, you know what, just because I'm young doesn't mean my opinion is worthless. So he said, I got to give it to you. Behold, I waited for your words. I gave ear to your reasons whilst you searched out what to say. Yea, I attended unto you, and behold, there was none of you that convinced Job or that answered his words. He said, I've sat here all this time, most of this day, listening to all these speeches. Not one of you has come up with a valid argument to convince Job that he's guilty of all the things you think he's guilty of, and yet you still condemn him. And then he says this, lest ye should say, we have found out wisdom, God trusteth him down, God thrusteth him down, not man. That's their whole argument. God is punishing him. Now, he hath not directed his words against me, neither will I answer him with your speeches. In other words, he says, what I'm about to say, I'm not going to recap what you just said. Now remember, all three of these guys basically kept saying the same thing over and over and over again. Job, you've done something terrible. You're a secret sinner. You're a hypocrite. You've been mocking God, and now he's punishing you. It was the same speech, just different wording. This guy says, that is not what I'm about to say. They were amazed. They answered no more. They left off speaking. When I had waited, for they spake not, but stood still and answered no more, I said, I will answer also my part. I also will show mine opinion. He said, I've sat here, I've listened, I've heard every word that's been said. And he said, and when all you guys ran out of soap and finally stopped talking, I decided, you know what, it's time for me to say. Now, tell me if you know somebody like this. You ever been around somebody like this? He says, for I am full of matter. The spirit within me constraineth me. Behold, my belly is as wine which hath no vent. It is ready to burst like new bottles. You ever been around somebody like that? They're like, I got to say it, or I'm just going to blow. You know, there's some people that cannot resist giving their opinion on any matter, whether it's asked for or not. Now think about this for a second. These four guys, who are all friends, have been having this incredibly long conversation about really kind of personal matters. This guy had wandered up somewhere at the beginning and just sat there and listened. And now he says, I want to tell you what I think. Now most of us, now understand, as far as we know, he doesn't know them. Now there's debate about that, but the Bible's not clear. If you were at Walmart and you ran into a friend of yours, and you were standing there having a really personal conversation about some issue that was going on in one of your lives, and some stranger walked up and just stood there and started listening, and all of a sudden when there was a lull said, you know what, I know you didn't ask, but I just got to tell you what I think about this. How would you feel about that? Most of us would be like, you know, who are you, and why should we listen to your opinion? But this is one of those guys, and again, we all know people like this, that just cannot stop himself. He has to voice this. There are people out there that just cannot not have an unvoiced opinion. They are so convinced that what they have to say is so important that they got to say it. It's just, I know that what I'm thinking is so much more important. I just got to tell you what I'm thinking. Now, that's kind of this guy's mindset. He says, I'm like wine that doesn't have a top that you can take off and let it vent and blow out. He says, I'm about ready to bust. I've got to say what's on my mind. I will speak that I may be refreshed. I will open my lips and answer. Now watch this again. Now this guy's going to say some valid things, but the attitude I want you to notice. He says, I'm going to talk. Here's what he's basically saying. So I'll feel better. Now let that sink in, that sense. He's saying, I'm going to tell you what I think of all of you, and then I'll feel better. And there's people that do that all the time. They've got to say something, not to benefit who's listening, but to make themselves feel better. And that's what Elihu is, that's a part of what he's doing here. He says, let me not, I pray you, accept any man's person, neither let me give flattering titles unto man, for I know not to give flattering titles. In so doing, my Maker would soon take me away. Now, that's the introduction. That's the first. Now, here's why I think this guy's got some valid issues, some valid points to make. Through the years, and I've gone back and forth on this guy as well, and I know a lot of people that have. But there are a lot of people that look at Elihu and say, he's totally unimportant to the story. What he has to say is not important. And they point to the fact that when God shows up, in fact, look at this. We're going to skip, we're going to come to this later. This is at the end of the book. God is speaking. Listen to what it says here. And it was so that after the Lord had spoken these words unto Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is kindled against thee and against thy two friends, for you have not spoken to me the things that is right, as my servant Job hath. When God finally showed up, as he's about to do, once this Elihu guy gets finished talking, God's going to show up. And at the end of it, God looks at Job's three friends and lets them have it. Says, none of what you've said is right. Everything you said about Job is wrong. But and God addresses Job, and God addresses his three friends. Who's the only person God doesn't address? Elihu. Now you can look at that two ways. Some people look at that and say, well, the reason God didn't address this guy is because what he said is so unimportant it doesn't even matter. That's one way to look at it. You know what the other way to look at it is? God didn't say anything to him because what he said was what? He was right. Now, it's easy to say, well, this guy, what he says is so unimportant, God doesn't even address him. But here's the question you have to answer then. If what this guy says is so unimportant that God doesn't even care, why is he given 6 chapters in the book of Job? That's an interesting question, right? I mean, God, as far as I know, God doesn't put any filler in the Bible. You know, it's not like God said, well, you know, the book of Job been long enough. Let's let this guy ramble on for a while and we'll keep. It's not important. Nothing he says matters, but let's just fill up some pages. I don't think God does that. So if God allowed this guy to ramble on for 6 chapters and recorded it and saved it for us, and then God didn't address him in a negative way like he does Job and his 3 friends, it seems like the answer may be, hey, maybe what he was saying had some merit. Now, I want to show you what he had to say, and we're going to focus on the part that he says to Job. What he says about his 3 friends is obvious. When we've touched on it, he's going to elaborate on that. But basically what he's saying about his 3 friends is, you know what? You guys are a one-trick pony. The only thing you've got is this. Job is suffering. Job has had terrible setbacks, health-wise, financially, relationally, every which way. And your only answer is, God must be angry with him and God is punishing him. He says that's all you got. You got one answer. Now he's going to turn to Job, and here's basically what he's going to say to Job. Job, in a lot of ways, you're like them. You've only got one answer. Your answer is, well, you know what? As far as I know, I haven't done anything terribly wrong, and I think God is mad at me. I think God has abandoned me. I think God is angry with me. I think God is ignoring me, and if I could just find God and talk to him, we could work all this out. He says, you're blaming God. Your friends are blaming you, and you are blaming God. Y'all got nothing else. It's either this extreme or this extreme. It's either you're a secret sinner and God is punishing you, or God has abandoned you and is allowing you to go through all this for some unknown reason. What this guy suggests is, maybe there's a third option. Have you ever been around people that are very extreme about every issue? It's either this or it's this, and there's no middle ground. Can I tell you that with a lot of issues, the middle ground is usually where the answer is? It's not on this extreme and it's not on that extreme. It's somewhere in the middle. And that's what this guy is about to say. He's going to look at Job's friends and he's going to say, all you've got is God is punishing him for some secret sin, but yet you can't prove it. You don't know what it is. Job has pointed out there are other people that are openly sinners and God's not punishing them. So what you're saying doesn't make any sense. And he's looking at Job and saying, Job, you know what? Your thing is you think God has abandoned you for some unknown reason and God's your enemy. Now let's look at just a little. We're just going to look at it. Remember, this is 6 chapters long, so we're only going to hit a couple of highlights. Listen to what he says. Now he's talking to Job. This is not directed at Job's 3 friends. This is directed at Job. He says, surely thou hast spoken in my hearing, and I have heard the voice of thy word saying. This is what Job said. I am clean without transgression. I am innocent. Neither is there iniquity in me. Is that what Job said? Yeah. Job said, as far as I know. Now again, he didn't claim to be perfect. What he said was, as far as I know, there's nothing in my life where I violated God's law or way in some horrible way that would make God want to punish me. That's what he said. And the guy's quoting him correctly. He said, he's continuing, he's saying, Job, this is what you said. Behold, that's God. Now remember, this is Job talking. God findeth occasions against me. He counteth me for his what? Enemy. He said, I haven't done anything, but God is mad at me. God has abandoned me. God is letting me go through something for no good reason. He putteth my feet in the stocks. He marketh all my path. And then this is Elihu talking. Remember, he was talking for Job. Now he just looks at Job and says, behold in this, thou art not just. In other words, he looks at Job and he says, listen, I've already told you 3 friends that they're all wrong. They're all just way off target here. He said, but I want to tell you, so are you. And he says, and when you make the argument that God is unfairly letting you go through something for no good reason, he says, you're not right. That's wrong, Job. Now here's the argument this guy is going to make. And for some of us here tonight, this is worth you coming out on a rainy Wednesday night. The argument this guy's going to make is sometimes God allows us to go through things not because he's angry at us, not because he's our enemy or he's abandoned us or he just doesn't care, but that God allows us to go through things for other reasons. And see, that's what nobody in this whole thing has considered. Job's friends never considered, well, maybe God's letting Job go through this, not because he's mad at him, not because he's a secret sinner, but because God is trying to teach Job something. That never crossed anybody's mind. Never crossed Job's mind. Job never said, well, you know what? I know I haven't committed any terrible sin. Maybe God is letting me go through this to teach me, to prepare me, to help me in some way. Job never said that either. And that's what this guy's jumping all over all of. He's saying, maybe the reason Job is going through this is not because God's angry at him, not because God has abandoned him, but because God is doing some work that we don't understand. By the way, that's dead on. Remember chapter 1? Why was Job going through all this? Was it because God was angry at him? No. What did God tell Satan? Have you considered my servant Job? There is none like him. Job is going through this to prove to the whole world that there are some people whose faith is so strong that no matter what they go through, they will not abandon God. But nobody ever came to that conclusion. This guy shows up and says, well, hey, maybe there's something else going on. He says, I will answer thee that God is greater than man. Why dost thou strive against him? For he giveth not account of any of his matters. In other words, he just said, God doesn't know us an explanation. God's God. And if God wants to let us go through something for whatever reason he has in mind, he doesn't know us an explanation for that. Remember, that's what Job wanted, an explanation. Remember, he said, if I could just find God, we could have a talk, he could explain all this to me. The guy's saying, you don't deserve an explanation. God doesn't owe us that. God is God. His ways are above our ways. And if God sees fit to let us go through something for whatever the reason may be, he doesn't have to give an account of that to us. For God speaketh once, yea, twice, yet man perceiveth it not. Now watch this. This is very important. He says there's 2 ways that God sometimes speaks to us. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falleth upon men and slumberings upon the bed. Now we all know there's stories in the Bible where God came to people in a vision and spoke to them, and that's certainly one of the ways. Then he openeth the ears of man and sealeth their instruction, that he may withdraw man from his purpose and hide pride from man. He keepeth back his soul from the pit and his life from perishing by the sword. He chasteneth also with pain upon his bed, and the multitude of his bones with strong pain. Now he goes on to talk about it, and again, for sake of time, we're just having to kind of hit the highlights here. He says sometimes God speaks to us through dreams and visions, but he says, but sometimes God speaks to us through suffering. I would dare say that anybody here that's been through real suffering, real loss, real pain, You probably didn't enjoy it. I certainly haven't enjoyed the ones I've gone through. But tell me if this isn't true. Most of us would say the closest we've ever been to God is when we were going through difficult times. When you're up on the mountaintop, the tendency can be to forget about God, right? Everything's going great. I got no problems. I got nothing to pray about. I got nothing to worry about. When you're in the valley and all you have is God, you get really close to Him. And this guy is making the point, sometimes God speaks to people in visions and dreams, but he says sometimes God speaks to us through suffering. Now, let me give you something real quick, and we're going to close. In the New Testament, does anything else in the Bible kind of go along with that idea? That sometimes God uses suffering not to punish, not to show He's angry, not because He's abandoned us, not because to show He's forgotten us, but to do something in our life that He's trying to accomplish. Let me give you a couple of quick examples. 1 Peter 1. Simon said, wherein you greatly rejoice, though now for a season, if need be, you are in heaviness through manifold temptations. Here, Peter's talking to people that were suffering. Now listen to what he said. That the trial of your faith, being much more precious than of gold that perisheth, though it be tried with fire, might be found unto praise and honor and glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ. Here's what Simon is saying. He's saying sometimes God lets us go through suffering, not because we've sinned, not because He's mad at us, not because He's forgotten us or abandoned us, but because He's trying to increase our faith. Sometimes you go through trials so that God can build our faith up, so that God can teach us to think about the children of Israel. Why were they in the wilderness for 40 years eating manna? What did God want them to learn? That they could count on Him for their every need, to increase their faith, their reliance on Him. That's what Simon says. In the book of Hebrews, it says, for they verily for a few days chastened us after their own pleasure, but He for our profit, that we might be partakers of His holiness. In other words, most likely Paul, most likely the author of Hebrews, says, hey, you know what? Those people that were throwing us in prison, they were doing it because they thought, hey, we're going to really get these guys. What they didn't realize is God was working that out for our profit, so that we could more closely identify with Him. Now, no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless, afterward, it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. In other words, Paul says in the book of Hebrews, he says it's never fun going through the valley when you're in the valley. But he says a lot of times afterward, when it's over, you look back and realize, I was never closer to God. My faith was never stronger. I was never more committed than I was during those moments. Most of us pray more, worship more, reflect on God more when we're in the valley than when we're on the mountaintop. And sometimes God lets us go through that for that reason. But there's something else. 1 Corinthians, Paul again. For we would not, brethren, have you ignorant of our trouble which came to us in Asia, that we were pressed out of measure, above strength, insomuch that we despaired even of our life. Now, Paul's saying there were times when we were just about ready to give up and die. But we had the sentence of death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God, which raiseth the dead. Paul said, even in those moments of extreme testing, it taught us to rely on God. Let me give you the most famous one. Now again, we've made this comparison several times these last few weeks, that there are arguments that the reason Job suffered so much is because he had done something terrible. And I've asked the question, if that were the case, I wonder what God would say about Paul, or what these guys would say to Paul. Paul suffered terribly all of his life. Listen to what he said. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall in. I'm sorry, this is in James. We're going to skip this one for sake of time. He says, unless I should be exalted above measure, through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me, what? Thorn in the flesh. Why? Why did God allow that suffering? The messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. And He said unto me, my grace is sufficient for thee. My strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches and necessities and persecutions and distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong. You know why sometimes God allows us to go through the things that Job went through? It's because sometimes it makes us stronger. Sometimes Paul said, lest I should be exalted above measure. In other words, Paul said, so I wouldn't become prideful. So I wouldn't think that I was some big deal. I mean, could pride have very easily been a big issue with Paul if he had let it? I mean, everywhere he goes, everybody tells him, you're the greatest Christian that ever lived. That'd make you prideful, wouldn't it? He says, no. God made sure I didn't get prideful. God made sure my faith is strong. This guy's got a point, folks, that we need to hear. His point is, sometimes God allows us to go through suffering. Not because he's punishing us. Not because he's abandoned us and mad at us or abandoned us. But because he's trying to teach us something. He's trying to improve our faith. He's trying to increase our reliance on him. He's trying to build us up into the person he wants us to be. Is it any wonder that when God shows up, when this guy finishes speaking, he has nothing to say to this guy? You know why? Because I think he nailed it. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. And Father, I